A changing pattern, and how a good organization can adapt with Evan Hadfield. Evan Hadfield's fascination with engagement started when he produced the video of Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield performing an acoustic version of David Bowie's space oddity, Well in Space, which put Canada on the world map for space exploration. Now, with his brand new creative digital agency, Launchpad, Evan Hadfield has taken on an ambitious mission to amplify the voice of Canadian brands across the world. Houston, we do not have a problem. Please welcome your out-of-this-world marketer, Evan Hadfield.
Wow, that is the coolest introduction I think I will ever personally have to a room. Wow, thank you all so much for being here. This is really, really cool for me. Normally, I stand in the corner while my dad gets the spotlight. It is really, really nice to be here. I presume that very few of you actually know me, but I bet a lot of you know my work. I am generally in the background doing strategy. I don't normally come up on stage to talk, but I thought that this would be a really good opportunity to sort of tell a story that will go against a lot of the grain of what you hear today. Because I'm not a marketer, and I'm definitely not a social media marketer. What I am is an English major, which is, I know, normally you don't admit that in a group of business people, but I am, in fact, an English major, and a lot of that sort of feeds into what I've done and what I do. Today, I'd really like to tell a story, and actually, to go back, when I thought about coming to do this presentation, I talked with my speaking agency and said, well, okay, well, what do they want to hear? What are they going to want to hear from me? I have a lot to say, but what do they want? And they said, oh, just talk about what you do, talk about what you've done with your father, and I'm sure it'll be great. And that wasn't really helpful to me. But what was really helpful were actually the questions so far that have been in the audience. So forgive me if a little bit is going to be off the slides, but I'm trying to answer some of the questions that I've heard while walking around the room. Specifically, the most important question I'm going to answer is one that came from the back, and unfortunately I don't remember who, but it was about social media being overwhelming. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the idea that there's 1 million to 2 million people constantly tweeting around what you're doing? How do you break into that? How do you make your own voice? And it is overwhelming. It overwhelms me all the time. I have about 4.5 to 5 million followers online on networks that I operate. And every day I wake up and I think, okay, well, you have to say something to them. So what do you say? And that's really intimidating. It's almost as intimidating as standing on stage and giving a talk, which I should note is the number one fear of people. Number 2 is death. So number 1 fear of people is actually stand on stage and talk, slightly more than death. So currently I'm surviving, I guess. I'd like to go into my presentation if possible. How do I, there we are. There we go. I run a company called Launchpad in Toronto. Launchpad is just a digital media agency that's meant to help, as you may have heard from the intro video, Canadian brands to sort of maximize their potential, to speak to a larger audience, and more than that, to do what's called rebranding, to take a currently existing paradigm and shift it so that people understand that it's something new now, something bigger, or something completely different. And the first major case that I did with my company was serendipitous. And this is the story that I'm going to try to focus on today, which is how I turned my father from sort of an unnamed astronaut into being the preeminent voice of space travel in Canada and around the world. And a lot of this is serendipitous for me because, as I said, this isn't my background. I didn't grow up in any of this. A lot of this story actually starts with the fact that this isn't who I am. A lot of what I was able to do here comes from the idea that I didn't know the nuts and bolts of what I was really trying to do. All I knew was that I had a father who wanted to maximize his time. So to tell that story, I'd really like to go back to the beginning for me. And I realize there's a bit of vanity in there, but there's a very well-dressed boy just trying to get out in this presentation. And this is me, and a lot about this, actually, I feel summarizes what I'm going to say today, because it's all under the surface. On one hand, this is just a picture of a boy on his first day of school, but on the other, it really is indicative of why my life is different and what allowed me to come up with the plans for my father. The first being that by the time this picture was taken, I'd moved 5 times. I'd lived in 5 different places, and this is my first day of school. By the end of that school year, I'd lived in 2 more. All of those places, other than 2, were in the United States, where I grew up predominantly as a Canadian abroad. My father calls himself the Zed police, so anytime you say Z, he'd come running in from another room and say, Zed, and then you'd have to say Zed until he left. So I grew up thinking of myself as sort of other, an outsider looking back in. And to me, because I didn't grow up in Canada, I didn't really know what Canada was. To me, it was something I was told about. That's who you are. That's who you're defining yourself as, and that's who you're an ambassador for. You're Canadian. But I was in Texas. Nobody wants to be Canadian in Texas. People in Texas do not take well to Canadians. So growing up in Texas, I was constantly being pushed into this corner. I wouldn't say the Pledge of Allegiance. Does everybody here know the Pledge of Allegiance, at least in concept? In the United States, every morning in class, you wake up and you say, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. Every morning, which I always thought was really weird. I mean, if Russia did that, the United States media would be so upset about their propaganda and training their kids about X and Y. But as a Canadian, I was told, don't do that. Don't ever speak to that. And so I grew up with this really odd concept of what Canada was going to be when someday I returned. It would be this perfect land of people just like me. But in the end, what I realized is that I'd conceptualized it. I'd personified Canada as this thing that I could then relate to and say, I'm with them. I'm part of that group, that Canadian group. And it was that sort of understanding that Canada was a brand, Canada was a concept, and it wasn't the country I was living in, it wasn't the country I was from, it was something that I could attach myself to as a personal identifier that really helped me to start thinking about marketing whenever it actually did come up. And from those 7 transfers before I was in grade 2, I continued moving. When I turned 17, I moved to Japan, and I didn't come back for over a decade. I've done about 15 different careers for 6 months, roughly, at a time. I taught scuba diving in Hawaii. I taught kindergarten in Okinawa. I ran a factory in China. I did sports journalism in Latvia. I was a tour guide in Bosnia. I've done a wide variety of things that have absolutely nothing to do with my topic. And I wasn't really going for a career at that point in my life. All I knew is that I wanted to keep traveling, and I really wanted to know, what do other people do with their lives? What's important to everyone in the world? Not just me, not just my culture, but as an outsider going around, I wanted to know, well, how do I fit in? How do I interact? How does my brand fit theirs? And what do people do? And that was really, really cool. And I really loved doing it. But then I met my wife, and she said, you know what, you're going to probably want to settle down and make some money. And I thought, that's not a terrible idea. So I went and I did my MBA at a German university in Mannheim, actually in a castle, which is, come on, Canada, we need to get some castle universities. But I did my MBA, and this really started to solidify all of the things I'd been doing. And I realized that all these little touch points that I'd gone to, from one point going to China, from one point going to Japan, from one point going to Latvia, I learned that there's a lot of similarities between who we are. There's a lot of similarities between what's going on in Thunder Bay and what's going on in Ghana that we just don't really realize because we don't have the experiences of those 2 places. And not just that, but they can be applied in every direction. They can be applied to business, they can be applied to personal life, they can be applied to your community. Once you start learning the patterns and the systems by which everyone operates, not just us, not just our community, you can start to touch people 1,000 miles away with a message that you felt only might have resonated right here. And on my final day of school, on my graduation, my father came to come give a talk, which is generally what happens whenever you have an astronaut father. When you graduate from something, he comes and gives a talk. So this was the final stage of that for me. He came and gave a talk at my school, and because he wasn't famous then, only about 20 people showed up. Now it would be in the 15,000. But 20 people showed up, and they sat down, and he gave them this great talk, saying, okay, so you've just finished your MBA. You have all this potential, all this capacity, all this experience. What do you do with that? What's the point? Why did you get it? Was it to make more money, to raise your career? Or do you actually have a purpose in what you're doing with this? And I thought about that, and it was definitely a good point. I never really know where I'm going next, as you might be able to tell from my presentation. So I really liked that point. I thought, what am I doing? But then I thought, he wasn't really saying that for me. He was saying it for himself, because 2 months after my graduation, he was flying to space for his 3rd and final time for a 5-month mission to be the commander of the International Space Station, which is history. It's really tough to imagine history as it's happening, But that's history. What he was doing was going to make pages of Canadian textbooks in the future. And that means something. It especially means something to the people who are taking part in it and doing it. So he wasn't really asking my MBA, how are you going to maximize the skills you've learned? What he was saying was, he was vocalizing his concern of, how do I maximize my time when I'm there? I've got this amazing experience that 7 Canadians have ever had. How do I make sure that all 33, 35 million of us know what that was? How do I make sure that people cared? When we started his mission, less than 5% of the country knew we had a space agency. That's incredible. I mean, we as Canadians were the 3rd group of people in space, but we don't even know we have a space agency. So that was a big fundamental issue. So he came to me and he said, okay, well, you just finished your MBA. You have all these skills. I have a problem. Until you find a job, could you please try to solve my problem? I said, okay, I can take that time and I can try to solve your problem. So I started looking at it from an MBA point of view, and I realized that I'm not truly an MBA. I have that degree, but that's not who I am. I need to look at it from an English major's point of view. I need to look at it as a narrative, as a story, and break it down to its basic parts. So I started to break down the problem. The problem is that, first and foremost, NASA, the CSA, and all space agencies are in decline. They've been in decline for quite some time. Specifically with NASA, they've been in decline since the final moon landing, so since the 70s. And that's a big issue, because every year you're expected to do more with less. And I doubt that's any different for anyone in this room. Every year you're expected to do more with less. So how do you do that? You know you're not going to have a budget coming into this. You know that whatever they did last time will be bigger than whatever you did this time. So how do you reset it? And I started thinking about it kind of like James Bond. You know, there's like 18 James Bond films, but they don't really list them that way because they know if they did that by number 18, you'd be incredibly bored with the concept. Well, Dad was going up for Expedition 3435, and they're all called EXP and then a number, and they have very similar marketing, and they have less money than before. So really, you're joining a cycle of boring sequels in which you're not going to do anything new. How do you break out of that cycle? How do you do something new when this is your issue? And on top of that, and this is something people rarely think about, let's say you want to film a video on the space station. Well, you start here in the European laboratory, you float down through Russia, you float through the United States, you float through Japan and back into the EU, and you take a picture of the Canadarm floating on the outside. Now let's say you filmed this with an American camera, but you took the audio on a Canadian iPad. The American government, and therefore the American people, owns that video. The Canadian government, and therefore the Canadian people, own that audio. The video itself can't be shown until all 5 countries have agreed that that video is acceptable to be shown. There is more bureaucracy here than I've ever seen anywhere in my entire life. If anyone here works with the government, you work with 1. This works with 5 simultaneously. And it's a huge issue that people just don't recognize, really limits what astronauts can do in space, because every one of those people has to agree. And then I looked at the problem as well. It's not that these are all one organization. These are 5 competing organizations. These are essentially 5 oil companies who have agreed to drill into one area, but they're still competing with one another. So if you work with NASA, they won't care about what happens outside of the United States. If you work with the Canadian Space Agency, they couldn't care less if you reach outside of Canada, because they're not paid, nor are they actually judged based on how other countries react to their footage, their content, that sort of thing. So you've really already got 5 segmented, competing partners who want to disagree with each other and make your life more complicated. And that's the ground for wherever we started working. On top of that, I started to look at some of the other astronauts who'd been in space recently who had done what NASA considered very well on social media. And one of the things that you can't see from there, but the top guy, Ron Garan, on his Google Plus page has 3.3 million followers, which sounds incredibly impressive. I mean, 3.3 million people, by God. But if you look at his Google Trends, you'll notice that he was at no point actually Googled. Nobody cares who he is or what he was doing. Do those 3 million followers have any actual value? Not really. Because when he posts something, it doesn't go anywhere. Nobody finds out about it. Nobody from outside of his people is ever looking at it. In one way, it looks like, if you look at the analytics, he's had incredible success. But on the other hand, I can virtually guarantee none of you had heard his name before I said it. Why is that? Dad has less followers than that. He has about half. And yet most of you know his name already. And that's the real fundamental difference of what I'm going to talk about today. which is how to get out of this trap. This trap right here is the biggest trap for an astronaut, and it was the first thing I had to overcome. And I call it the Greek finance minister problem. I've invented that term. And the Greek finance minister problem is, between 2010 and 2014, you probably read the Greek finance minister's name 50 times. And it changed, of course, but I bet none of you can tell me what it is. Because what's the point of memorizing that term? From the sentence, Greek finance minister name did X, the only important parts of the sentence in your mind, going back to being an English major, is the operative term of Greek finance minister and then the verb of what was done. You don't need to learn his name, so your brain, instinctively being lazy, doesn't memorize it. I don't know if you know this, but to get someone to use their frontal cortex, it takes about the same energy output as jogging. So if you want someone to actually think about what you're doing, change their mind, reassess, you need to get them to jog. And jogging's terrible. I hate jogging. So I can imagine that a lot of other people are having a lot of trouble with it as well. So getting people to rethink what you're doing is a huge issue, especially if they're not looking past the first word. And Greek finance minister problem applies incredibly strongly to astronauts. What's the most important part of astronaut Ron Garan did X in space? Well, it's not Ron Garan. So Ron Garan ends up becoming less important. So how do you solve this problem? This is the fundamental issue, and this is what I'm going to talk about today. And I guarantee that even though none of you will probably grow up with an astronaut father, all of these principles are going to apply to you. They apply to communities, they apply to businesses, they apply to personal people, they would apply to reserves. If you want information out, this is how information is disseminated in the modern era. So how do you do it? Well, I looked at companies, and I said, what are the most successful companies in a digital sense? In a digital era, who's winning? And Red Bull, I think, does an incredibly good job of what I'm about to talk about. So if somebody blew through this window wearing a jetpack with a giant fan over the top, obviously jumped from an airplane, you would kind of expect that they have Red Bull somewhere on their body. Because you know that Red Bull sponsors extreme sports. And why does Red Bull do it? Well, Red Bull's trying to personify themselves as someone you want to hang out with. Does any of this have to do with what Red Bull does? No, of course not. Does any of this actually cross over with people who drink Red Bull? No. I mean, most of the people who are doing energy or high energy sports aren't drinking energy drinks. They're generally high energy people. That's what brings them to this. But Red Bull wants to associate themselves with that. So when you think of Red Bull, you think of a person. You think of a concept. You don't think of a company. You certainly don't think of their product. You think of that guy flying in or the guy jumping out of the airplane from up in space, because that's what Red Bull is. They also sell this product, but that's who they are. So I looked at Red Bull, and actually you saw this exact ad earlier in the first presentation, which is, I don't know if you've ever seen this ad, but it's Apple and Windows, Mac and PC. And Apple's taken that exact same concept as Red Bull, and they've just made it simple. They've said, okay, I'm a Mac. This is the guy. This is who you're looking at when you're looking at this product. I'm a PC. And even though those guys are probably the same age, they give off very different understandings of what those companies mean. And Apple's done a very good job of not just positioning who they are, but positioning who their competition is. Who of those two would you rather hang out with? Well, they've made it quite clear to you. They know that if you start thinking of Apple as Justin Long, who's the guy in the less dorky outfit, if you're trying to hang out with Justin Long, then you're going to go with Apple. And Apple's done an incredibly good job of figuring out who they are. So I thought about this with my father as well. And it can be kind of weird to say, well, okay, you want to personify a person, but just use the person. But that's not how it works. You don't just use the person. You truly have to personify them if you want to break out of the Greek finance minister problem. They need to be the point. So in a sense, I tried to characterize my father. And we discussed this with him as well. I said, okay, well, what are the sides of your personality that we need to characterize? What are the ones that we need to draw out? And what are the ones that we need to bring down? How are we going to turn you into a cartoon character version of yourself that people can actually join on with? If you're just a person, that's great, but you need to personify. You need people to know who you are outside of the headline. And so, sorry about these slides. I promise I won't read straight off of them. I went back to my MBA and I said, okay, well, what are the basic tenets of that? If I were going to start a new company, if it wasn't a person, but let's say it was a product, what would I do? I would say, okay, well, what's my product? What do I have here? What is it? In this case, it's a man, so who is that product? What are the parameters of what it can do? Where is it seen? What's the point? Who would want this? And I thought about it, and I said, okay, so what is my product? Well, first and foremost, he's an astronaut. He works for the Canadian Space Agency, which means something. The Canadian Space Agency is a great company to work for out of the space agencies because it's tiny. And anyone who's worked in bureaucracy knows that the smaller the bureaucracy, the better when you're trying to interact with it. So NASA's marketing budget is actually larger than the CSA's entire budget, manned and unmanned, just to market NASA. So they've got a huge budget that the CSA doesn't have. So that's already one point on our side. He's Canadian. And most Canadians are pretty proud of it, but they don't recognize how strong our brand is abroad. We are the most respected country on Earth, according to the most recent polls. That's a big thing. But it can fall apart as well. If you go to Peru right now, actually one of our mining companies has murdered an ecological protester. And in Peru right now, if you read the news, Canada is hated because of what one of our companies did. Because our brand in that country has actually started to change who we are and started to move forward. So I started thinking about, okay, so he's Canadian. For the most part, that's accepted around the world. But where is it most accepted? Thinking about it, Commonwealth countries, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, other places that speak English, not really the United States. And a lot of people think the United States would be a natural extension for a Canadian, but it isn't, because Canadians can only win the United States for the most part, if they Americanize. If they take on an American identity, if they act like an American, think William Shatner or Ryan Gosling or any of the other successful stars in the United States who are Canadian, they don't really promote that voice. That's starting to change a little bit, but for the most part, if you want to win as a Canadian without changing who you are, you look to the Commonwealth, because they're ready to accept you. So I started to think about that, looking at the audience, and I said, okay, so if I have, oh, I missed one point, which is also he's my father. Being my father is really important because I'm the one putting out the message. So at the end of the day, what am I really making him into? I'm trying to make him into Canada's dad. If I have to come up with a running concept of who I'm making, it's Canada's dad, because I'm always going to treat him as a father. But also, I need to make other people think of him that way as well. So I started thinking about, if that's the case, who's the audience? Who's the audience who wants Canada's dad to talk to them? This is a pretty difficult thing to think of, but on the other hand, it's also fairly simple. You can generally say it's probably going to be kids, because they're the ones looking for a father figure. It's probably going to be positive people, because Canada has a positive identity and what we're doing is positive. You generally don't want to focus on anything negative at all, because it's not going to focus on the group that you're hitting. So I thought about my target audience. Where do I find them? And then I thought, well, crap, he's on a space station. His audience really isn't Canada at all. Even though the Canadian Space Agency wants that to be the case, his audience is the entire planet. He's looking down on it, and slowly he's starting to feel more and more like it. You go around the world every 92 minutes, you get 18 sunrises a day, you start to get to know the planet as a concept rather than a series of countries. So I thought about that, and I thought, okay, so who's my target market? I'm looking for a kid in the world who doesn't necessarily follow what I do, but would resonate. So I thought, okay, I think a 12-year-old boy in the Philippines is probably exactly who I want to target. Because a 12-year-old boy in the Philippines probably speaks rudimentary English as either a first or more likely second language, probably doesn't have a lot of money in education, but has all of those same similar patterns that I was speaking about at the start. They share the exact same life as us in a lot of ways. So if you're going to look to that kid, what do you do? What are you actually selling? Where do you find them? What do you talk about? What's your budget? Who can help you? Who's going to join you on this mission? And I started thinking about, well, I've got no money. I'm alone. I have no real expertise in this, and nobody knows who we are. So that's a pretty rough starting point. But I've got a lot of great content that people will probably want if I can get them to see it. The matter is getting them to see it. So I started using various social media, and I'm not really going to get into nuts and bolts about this right now. There's a lot of people here to talk about the nuts and bolts of social media. If you have questions about specifics, I'm happy to answer them. But for the most part, I'd like to do the overview. So I did use social media, predominantly Twitter, because that's where the news looks. If you want to be in the news about what you've done online, you have to do it on Twitter. Maybe not so much now, but 3 years ago, certainly. And I started thinking about the news. The news cares, but it's really tough to get the news to care big time. So CBC, BBC, RTE, which is the Irish radio, they don't care straight off. They care when they think others care enough that they'll get clicks from it. So what I started to do is I would say, take a picture of, I'll actually go forward for this. That bottom left corner is Porto Alegre, Brazil. Porto Alegre, Brazil is a pocket in Brazil that is a huge fan of Dad. 25,000 plus followers from that city alone. Why? Because that was the first city in Brazil where I got local news to talk about what we were doing. So if I took a picture of Thunder Bay, or if Dad took a picture of Thunder Bay, for example, and I wanted to promote that, I wouldn't go to CBC. I would go to all of the Thunder Bay media, all of the blog sites, everyone here who has a voice, and say, look at that picture, isn't that cool? And once you've done that 5 or 6 times, once you've done it with Thunder Bay and Timmins and Winnipeg and North Bay, by the time you've done that, CBC said, wow, every time he posts one of those, these small newspapers are getting a lot of push. We should start posting that too. And then you move up to the next level of media, and you move up to the next level of media, and you move up until finally you're BBC front page news, which is a really difficult process, but it was the first process towards solving the Greek finance minister problem. And I would actually write to the news and say, could you please put his name in the headline? Don't just say astronaut, because if you do that, it was irrelevant to me. It's almost as though it didn't happen. I need his name to be in the top so people start to see that it's him putting these out and not the concept of space. So I started also talking to celebrities, which some serendipitous, some by intent. William Shatner wrote us one day, and I just happened to be looking online and I saw it and I thought, well, that's a great opportunity. First of all, because William Shatner is a Canadian with a big following, but second, because there's a certain something about sci-fi meeting science that I knew people would like. If we wrote back to him in character and kept it going, I could guarantee virtually to myself that people would pick it up on their own and start talking about it. Because my real intent is just to get people to talk. It's not numbers. If I wanted numbers, I could be Ron Garan with my 3.3 million Google followers. But I want people to care. I want genuine change of behavior and influence. So I started tweeting William Shatner, and it took off and was very successful, and we tried that a number of other times with other celebrities, which was great. And we started moving forward. And we started trying to access all of the various capacities we could for free. The first being YouTube. YouTube is great because in 20 minutes you can have a video up that you just took, no problem. So Dad made over 100 videos in his time and space, about 120 total, aimed at that Filipino boy. So what did we talk about? Brushing your teeth, shaving, eating, going to the bathroom, playing music, everything that everybody does. So that you didn't need to think of him some esoteric character off doing what astronauts do. But he was a human. He was a reflection of us up there, doing what we do, showing us not what happens if an astronaut gets to space, but what happens if we get to space. What happens if you and I were there? What would we do? This is what we'd do. This is what we'd all do. And therefore, we started putting these out to say, not let's see what NASA's doing, but more, let's see what space is like. Let's try to view this from all of our perspectives. We did the same with Twitter. Like I said, with focusing on individual cities, focusing on individual towns, what we really wanted to do was show people not what their city looked like, but how it interacted with everything else. And it eventually became clear to a lot of our followers that cities look really similar. A city in Brazil and a city in Ghana and a city in Canada surprisingly have incredibly similar characteristics. And a lot of our fans started to fundamentally alter how they were viewing what we were doing, how they were viewing each individual photo as not somebody else's home, but another place on this planet where we exist. And that was a very fundamental shift. We actually started calling it, well, we stopped using the word them and started using the word us. And it started on a picture of Pakistan. And from there, we realized that it wasn't us. And that movement moving forward really allowed us to gain world exposure. People felt that they were on board. This wasn't a Canadian astronaut, esoteric scientist talking down to Canada. It was one of us, a human on a space station, talking to everyone about what we're all experiencing. And then we made music videos. I presume a lot of you would have seen our Space Oddity video, which we made, and I'd like to touch on that for a moment as well. The Space Oddity video followed a really similar mindset to what I'm doing now, which is patterns. So if you think about it, his main goal was, I want people to know we live in space. That's it. That's all I want. We live there. Since 2000, if you have a 15-year-old or younger child, they have never lived in a world that didn't have humans inhabiting space at any second of their life. That's science fiction. We've been living in space continuously for 15 years, but we don't realize it. You know, it's one of those things that just sort of passes by in society. So if you want to tell people that, how do you do it? How do you tell people we live in space? You can't just say those words because no one will share the information, right? You need to show people we live in space without ever saying those words. So how do you do it? You look at patterns. And I specifically looked at the pattern of exploration. So think about Canadian colonization, for example, in either direction, coming over the Bering or coming from Europe. What you usually do is you'll send your second son. The first son is kept at home to do farming. You'll take your second son, of which I am, and you'll send them to a foreign land that maybe they can survive in, maybe they can't. And if they survive there, great. They come back and they tell everyone, yeah, it's habitable, we could go there. If they don't, you know, probe dead. In space, we're doing the same thing. We sent Neil Armstrong to the moon. We're sending now robotic probes to Mars and Europa and other planets. But for the most part, we've settled. And that's something that we really haven't realized, is that we're not this first generation probe going out. We're not even the second generation who's setting up that first movement. We're the third generation who's now living there. And there's a quote from the second US president, John Adams, which I'm going to paraphrase, which is, "I'm a soldier, so my son's a merchant, so his son is a poet," which says, I'm a soldier to make sure that this land exists for us. My son is the merchant to make sure that it has a purpose. And then his son is the poet who tells us what it is. Because we need to know what this land is. And if you look at Canadian literature, again, I'm an English literature student, we generally study Canadian literature between 1820 and 1850. Why? Because that was our third generation for European settlers. And we generally look back on British movements that were happening in that time to show our difference to British literature, to say this is why we existed, this is who we were at that time. We still use all these principles, but we've applied them to a new Canadian mindset. So I thought about that with exploration in space, and I thought, okay, well, how can I do that? What happened in the early days of spaceflight that I would like to hark back to and say, look at where we are now? And Space Oddity came out about 2 years, I believe it was 2 years, maybe just a few months before the moon landings. So before we actually started to really engage the public with space. And it sort of defined at that time what space travel was going to be. It became this musical imagery of what space was and what it would be in the future. So I thought that would be a perfect thing to hark back to. I would like to say, we're so far advanced in our space life, in our space technology now, that we can look back to when we started and reflect. That's how far along we are. And I think most people who watch this video, without even realizing it, now know we live in space, because we couldn't have made that video if we didn't. It's part of the pattern. Whether or not you recognize that you now know we live there, the video made it clear to you. And that's sort of the entire purpose of all of it, is to set aside that video and say, this is why it matters, this is why it's different. We also did a video with Ed Robertson of the Bare Naked Ladies, as you can see in the bottom corner, that was sung live by 700,000 children across the country, together, about exploration, about science, and about space. Those children took that home, they talked with their parents, and we got 2 new followers from every parent who heard their kid talk about that. All 700,000 kids who memorized that song and sang with him now know we live in space. Every single person who took themselves the time to get involved in this. Think about what those kids now think their future could be. You know, when my father was growing up, even when I was growing up, it was really hard to think a Canadian could be an astronaut, let alone command a space station. And now kids are growing up singing with them live. Those kids think, well, I could do that. Of course I could do that, because this is now part of what humans do. We've added it to the spectrum of what humans do. We've sort of removed the concept of space being this other world. And the North actually has a really similar concept where everyone in the South thinks, oh, but it's other. It's not other. It's just another extension of where we are. So we took these and we tried to use these music videos to really highlight the unspoken side of what we were doing, to really take that voice, that personification that I was trying to make of who he is, this Canada's dad, and drive it home. And especially with the second video, you get a lot of that. And we had so much response. You can see Margaret Atwood in the bottom there with her little mustache and a young girl at the top. We had thousands of people send in photographs of themselves with mustaches, dressed like astronauts, happily entertaining their kids with what he was doing. And as has been mentioned here before, we tried to engage with that as much as possible to make sure that those people knew that Dad saw it and was really happy that they did it. And that's what kept increasing it, increasing it, and increasing it. And once we'd hit this massive market, and we'd got 500, 600,000 followers, we started thinking, okay, well now we need to start niching again. Because now that people know who we are, we need to remind them that we're relevant to them. So this actually occurred to me when one of our blind followers sent me a message saying, hey, you make a lot of video, but I'm blind. Could you please make something for me? And I said, well, of course. I mean, I hadn't even thought of it. Of course we'll make something for you. So we went and we recorded every sound on the space station that existed. And we put them up on SoundCloud for free. SoundCloud actually worked with us to offer it so that everyone could download it. And now there's, like the music that accompanied me on stage, there's plenty of electronica music that actually uses sounds from the space station because they wanted to integrate it into what they do. There's over 100 songs that have those sounds in them now. That's kind of cool to me. This concept that someone just wanted to take part, so they asked. They said, can I take part in what you're doing? And we fundamentally shifted to say, of course you can. Because this is about the world. It's about everyone. How inclusive can we be while still niching down to an important point that says, you can take part. Not the theoretical you, but you specifically. And there was a lot of art that came back from it. A lot of people, and this is what we were really hoping for. People took time out of their day to make jokes, to draw, to use him as a figure, not just a NASA figure, but a person, a completely separate icon, a branded personality, someone outside of the bounds of NASA. But, and it's funny, in my line of work, you get a lot of schizophrenia. We're sort of at the confluence of a lot of conspiracy theories. Didn't go to the moon, flat Earth, aliens, all those things. You get a lot of people like that. And you know, you look at analytics a lot, I presume, in your lives, but that was the analytic that really made me realize that he wasn't NASA anymore. Because they weren't coming to NASA to say, the moon landing didn't happen, you're all fake, you're all fake. They said, Chris Hadfield, you're fake. Which isn't true, but what it says to me is that they'd separated him, even in their minds. He was now culturally a separate thing from NASA. He was doing things different. Fake, apparently, but different. And to me, that was really fascinating. But this was really, really exciting for us to get this back. And if you look at the interest over time of what we've done, here's the amount of Google hits Dad got for about 4 years before he went to space. And then there's what happened whenever we went. So the fundamental altering of how people were viewing him, how people were interacting with him, in this, he'd been to space a different time. I mean, where was the interest? When he took off, CBC didn't even show up for the launch because it was unimportant. The Canadians did not care about what he was doing. Why would they? They had no reason to believe he was separate. They didn't really know the space agency, so why would they care? By the end of it, CBC could not stop talking about it, so it was a pretty good run. And also, on top of that, we aimed at the world and we got the world. Again, I know you can't read all this, but Canada, the United States, UK, Philippines. The Philippines is our 4th most viewed fan group in one of our networks. And why? Because I aimed at the Philippines. That was an intent of mine, to make sure that there were Filipinos who thought this was interesting. So that was really important to me to say, well, that was successful then. I know that I did what I was trying to do, and my brand is working in the way that I want it to. I generally don't look that much at statistics, honestly, because I think that they kind of cloud you towards what you're doing in the future. But these ones specifically. NASA also came to us and they said, listen, well, NASA really doesn't like me, first and foremost, because I don't work for NASA, I work for Canada, and there was one news article in the United States that talked about Dad, one, and it was why NASA will never be Chris Hadfield. So NASA's not super keen on me. But they came to us one day and they said, okay, but how does any of this matter? You know, I see that you've got some Twitter followers, I see that there's interest, but how does it matter? So I then went and I had to go prove it to them. And I found this, which is the space science site of NASA, which I've never tweeted about. I didn't even know existed until I looked it up, and has nothing to do with what we did. There's a perfect or near perfect linear connection between the day Dad started getting followers and the views on this site. We never talked about it. It has nothing to do with what we were doing, but so many people got on board with what he was doing that they thought, I would like to learn more about that topic. I'd really like to know what the science is going on in space. And the increase is obvious. I mean, there was a linear line of followers that changed dramatically once we started doing things that made people realize that space was not esoteric. It's something that they can take part in. And I think that's the real fundamental key, is to say that I didn't just affect what we were doing, but other people were obviously affected. Society obviously changed in a minor way due to what we were doing. And to me, that was the fundamental purpose. So I guess really what I'm trying to say for you, for the takeaway, is that everyone needs to realize that they have to characterize what they're doing. Companies fail online every day repeatedly because they never sat down and said, well, what are we? I know who we want as a customer, I know what products we have, but if people are looking at me on the internet, who am I to them? Am I a person or am I a company? I mean, how do I personify? Am I Red Bull? Am I a really cool dude? Do they know that? Or am I just a bunch of retweets? It's really easy, and my answer earlier about the bot, that's a really similar concept. If you're just retweeting what you've already done on Instagram over to Twitter, I mean, what do you look like to people? What is your personality? You're a robot. You have to be, or you wouldn't be automatically retweeting, right? So you're giving out this personality, this impression all the time about who you are and what you're doing. And the number one thing I advise companies whenever I go in to talk to them and they hire me for consulting is to sit down for an entire day and flesh out with every single member of your organization from the lowest rung forward on who you are as an organization. And you'll find that once you know what the forest is, and once you know what direction you're walking in, the trees become a lot less relevant. The individual specific touch points of how you get going west are far less relevant when you know, I'm this and I'm heading west through this forest. And a lot of companies never do that. They say, I just want customers. But social media is not for marketing, and that's a huge misunderstanding. Social media is for communication. It's not new, it's just word of mouth. You can now see the word of mouth and you can interact with it better, but this happened in the 1970s the same. You did something, people reacted to it, and they talked about it at home. The only difference is now you can follow, and you can see when they talk, and you can interact with them when they do it. But the principles have always been there, and the principles will always be there. The similarities are there. As networks change and social media develops into something new, I guarantee the principles will remain the same. They've always been there. Selling in the 1800s was no different than selling today. You need to have a very similar concept throughout your entire company of what everyone's saying. Your legal team needs to understand what your social media says because they're speaking with the same voice. Your advertising on a billboard needs to speak with that same voice. When you meet clients, it speaks with that voice because your company's a person. You're starting to personify it, and they need to act a certain way. And once every employee knows what that action is, what that person is, they can make the right decisions without oversight, without individually managing every single person every single time. And if you're going to be on social media, especially if you have one individual person doing it for you who's not managing the company, they need to know exactly who they are. Who are they speaking for? Are they just themselves trying to get interest, or are they the company? And to me, I think that is the fundamental difference that allowed us to succeed where other astronauts had failed. And I really appreciate that you guys listened throughout my entire spiel about it. And if any of you have any questions, I would love to answer them. So please, by all means.
Engage and the Anishinaabe Eski Development Fund would like to thank the sponsors of Engage 2016. TB Newswatch, TD Bank, T-Baytel, MNP, Shout Media.